I'm Thea Hilhorst of the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, and this is lecture 3 of my series on how to design and do your research. This lecture is about planning research in times of insecurity, when fieldwork may not be feasible. So we will talk about what else can you do and how will you know what is the right thing. Let's get started. I'm giving this lecture in the time of COVID-19, and of course that's a major hindrance for traveling, for doing fieldwork. It's a time of high levels of insecurity and anxiety for many people, including researchers. However, I also wanted to remind you there are many other reasons why sometimes fieldwork cannot be done in the way you hoped it would be done. For example, in times of conflict, disaster, maybe you cannot go to the field, or because you don't have your research permission, your research visa that you were hoping for, or simply because you've run out of money and you cannot go to the field. So this lecture is also for all of you who wanted to do fieldwork but cannot do fieldwork. So, have you abandoned the idea of fieldwork? Are you looking for alternatives? Or do you retain the possibility of fieldwork in the back of your mind, yet you want to consider a plan B? Then this lecture is meant for you. So what I'd like to do with you in this lecture is to explore non-fieldwork based research design. Note, before we go into this, that whatever choice you make, try to stay close to what you wanted to research. Your research interest is important. You knew it was important, you already felt this is something we have to look into. And also, you need to be interested to keep going. So whatever you choose, it has to be something that is close to what you wanted to research. Now, having that extra challenge of not going to the field can also mean that you enter venues that you never thought about. Crisis can also generate creativity and innovation. So who knows, we discover all new types of methodology that we never thought about, never considered to explore, but are really, really neat. The thing is that we always have to be explicit and transparent about the choices and the research process. So your methodology section might be longer in the end because you will explain how you moved away from fieldwork, what your alternatives are, and why you think these are good alternatives. Okay, welcome to an adventure. First option, remote research, meaning you get your data, the same data you wanted to get, but you get it in a different way. In this scenario, you get the data that you hope to get, not by directly interviewing people yourself. So first, you could try to do an interview with that same people through video conferencing or a telephone call. Of course, you first have to identify the people you are going to talk with. So this is not possible unless you have a local contact or perhaps an NGO that works with the people you're interested in, who can reach out, identify your research participants and ask for their permission on your behalf and explain what is the purpose of the research and whether they want to collaborate and be interviewed by you, long distance, over the phone or through video conferencing. A second step would be, or another option would be, that you actually ask your contact in the area or your colleague or whoever to go out and do the research for you, the interview for you. So in this case, somebody else will do the interview for you and send you the recording, the transcript, or the recording of that interview for you to analyze. Thirdly, you can use digital surveys or other invited spaces where participants can express themselves. If they have access to a computer and to internet, they can fill in a survey or they can write something on a Facebook page that you have open to ask people comments about a particular situation. Of course, this is, again, difficult because how will you know who are the participants that write on that page? So you have problems of selection and everything, but it is a possibility. Now, questions that you always have to ask yourself about any type of remote research. First, what is the scientific value of your data? Are these data really valid? Are they actually telling us something significant about the questions that we raised? And will your data set be rich enough? Is it not too superficial? How do you find the in-depth layers of understanding that you were looking for in your fieldwork? If it's not rich enough, it will be very difficult to analyze when people only give very brief answers to the question and don't elaborate. You cannot go on probing. Is it enough to analyze and answer your questions? Now, there are some precautions you can take to help you with these issues of scientific value of your data. First, triangulation. Try to see whether what you hear might be confirmed through other sources. So if you have a remote research with people in a village, in a conflict-affected area, for example, maybe there are some satellite images that you can use, and then you say, okay, now I see what they're talking about, that huge forest fire. I can actually see it on the satellite images, and now I can measure how large it was. So I have a sense of how those data work together. Or newspaper clippings that confirm some of the stories that people have told you in the interview. Second, it is of course possible and very important to train if you would ask somebody else to do the interviews for you. It is very important that this person is properly trained, because usually when you go out and ask the questions, you don't have just a list of questions in front of you, but in the back of your mind is all that literature that you've been reading. You know why you wanted to ask the questions. You know what you want to give as follow-up questions if you don't get an immediate answer. So try to fill in that person that does the research for you, perhaps even provide some key literature, and see whether that person really understands the meaning of the questions. And therefore it's also important that you always have feedback. Preferably after every interview, you will sit with the person who did the interview through a video conferencing or a telephone call, ask about the interview, the circumstances, the observations this person have, and then the interview starts to make sense and become alive for you. Also, you might want to simplify your data needs. When you do an interview yourself, you can probe. You can ask follow-on questions. Can you give an example? Do you remember another occasion where this happened? And then you get layers in what people say, and you can get layers because you also have your own observations about what people do. Now, if you have a research question that asks for that level of nuance, in-depth probing, then better perhaps change your your data needs. So change your research questions slightly so that the data you need are less deep and less layered, more fact or opinion based. Now, the other set of questions you have to ask yourself are of ethical nature. There are some real ethical issues with remote research. For example, can sensitive issues be discussed over the phone or through a third person? When you do a live interview and you ask about a topic that might raise anxiety or might be sensitive, you can read the body language, you can read the expression in somebody's face to feel the discomfort, and you can back out and say, let's not talk about this anymore, let's go for another question. Can you do the same over the telephone? Or when you see somebody on a screen, can that third person have that same sensitivity? Because it is not ethical to keep asking questions if that raises discomfort with the person you interview. Also, what is actually in it for the participants? And are they interested to really work with you? Are they not, very relevant in these days, preoccupied with surviving under Corona to ask your questions about something else, to respond to your questions about something else? But also, what is really in it for them? Are we not just using participants to extract data from them? When you're there live, there's always an immediate reward in an interview. Assuming that you're a nice person, it will probably be the case that the person you interview will also see the interview as a positive experience, as a moment that allowed him or her to tell the story, somebody was listening, which is very rewarding. And maybe that person feels like, wow, it helped me to think through my situation. So an interview can be a very rewarding experience for the person who's interviewing, as well as for the person who is being interviewed. When you're there and you stay a few months, maybe you work with a local NGO and you try to do something to help the situation. What if you're very far away? What will actually be in it for the people that you interview? Very important ethical question. And finally, have you guaranteed that there is informed consent and confidentiality? Are you sure that the person you're asking has made real effort to obtain informed consent and ensures confidentiality of what he or she is doing? Similarly, if you use a telephone or another remote device, how will you know that it's actually confidential? Alright, the next, that is that you work with data from similar participants. So in this scenario, you will adapt your category of research participants that can be reached. So you cannot reach the research participants you wanted. You look for other research participants that you can reach to answer your research questions. Of course, you have to slightly adapt the research questions because it's not your original group of participants, but it's a group that is sufficiently similar to still talk about your research question. For example, you were interested to do research with refugees in a very specific place. You cannot go there anymore, but perhaps there are refugees in similar situations that have written diaries, autobiographies, letters, drawings, photography that has been made public somewhere. That is in a platform available where you can look at it and analyze it. Or maybe they're Facebook entries or other net-based data that you find through nethnography. What are refugees in such a situation telling about themselves? You can also use databases from other researchers. Maybe other researchers who have a whole set of interviews that they allow you to read and reanalyze with your research question, because the original research had a particular question, but you want to look at that same research through different eyes with your research question. Sometimes it can be done. Or you find an alternative set of accessible participants. You could imagine that you retain your question, more or less, but you shift to do interviews with participants who live in the Netherlands. Maybe you were interested in people in a particular country, but some of them might be living in the Netherlands. You can find them and do the interviews with them. Now, these are all options, creative options, how you can go around that tacky issue when you cannot reach the research participants you wanted to do the research with. Questions you ask yourself. Is there still consistency between my research questions, the participants and the data? And the validity. How about the validity of my research? Is it actually valid to make claims to answer a research question on the basis of this particular data set with these particular people? And of course, again, you have to be very transparent and explain to your reader what choices you made, why you made them, and why you still think it is a valid piece of research. My third option here is that you change your research question and your research design. So in this scenario, you have to change the research design, so you don't need to obtain data anymore from communities. So you will probably have a new set of research questions in your domain of interest. Remember, stay close to your domain of interest. But instead of doing fieldwork, doing research among people in communities, you shift your question so it can be done in a very different way. For example, you can shift to policy or media studies, not what is happening to people on the ground and what are the stories they want to tell us, but what are the stories we find about those people in policy papers or in the media. And then, perhaps through a discourse analysis or interpretive policy analysis, there are many methodologies. You can find very interesting data and information about the people you're interested in, except it's not their views, but it's in the view of somebody else, which may also be very interesting. It can be a literature review that you decide, okay, I'm backing off from empirical work. I'm just going to do a very elaborate literature review. I broaden my research question and I go into the literature. Or net-based research, lots of new articles written about how you can use that vast internet as your place to find data that you want to analyze. There's so much to find on the internet, and there are many, many, many literature sources at the moment that help you to identify how to do an interesting research where the internet is your community of inquiry. And of course you can analyze existing databases. These could be any type of database from the UN or somewhere else or from a university. Analyze them, seek out some very specific features that you find into those data and try to interpret them. Now, all these strategies, they may or may not be combined with interviews, because very often people who take one of these research strategies still end up doing interviews, not with community members of their group of interest, but with key stakeholders, maybe other experts, maybe people who are responsible for the database, so we can ask them how they got to their database, what they did, or policy officers or journalists or whoever, representatives perhaps from the community that you can ask to comment on the way that media writes about them. So there might be interviews, but it is not necessary. Now if you do this, I have some pointers for you for when you don't do fieldwork and in your research design. Basically, all the rules apply about the structure and the consistency of your research design and your research paper. If you do research with a community, research with the internet, research with a database, the same rules apply. There has to be a flow that comes from the introduction, an initial literature review that tells you where the gaps are. So even when you do a literature review, you have to do an initial literature review saying that this is more or less what I know that people have written about, so this is where I want to focus on, and therefore I'm going to search the literature for my specific question. There come your research questions, your conceptual framework, your methodology, everything has to be there. You also need to have a very clear and feasible operationalization of your research question. For example, doing a literature review doesn't mean that you have 5 questions. You start to read all the literature and answer your question. No, you have to make it more specific. See the literature, see that book, see that written document as a person you want to ask questions from. So what are the questions you seek to answer by reading this piece of literature? That's the operationalization. You also need a very clear definition of the scope of your cases and your research population. And research population I now use in a very broad term. It could be people, it could be numbers, it could be websites, it could be reports, it could be anything. But you have to define the scope, the cases and the population. So you have to make it clear, your research question, that it is specific, and hence it more or less dictates the scope of your research population. And that is also because if it is more literature based, there is so much literature. You could also say, I'm interested in this particular question and there have been so many changes that I only want to use literature that has been written in the last 5 years. So that's my scope. I only use recent literature of the last 5 years. Or you only do use literature that is about a specific set of countries that you're interested in. I'm only interested in low-income countries. So you skip all the literature that is about middle or high-income countries. So in this way you define the scope, the cases, your research population as if you would be going to the field. Again, we also need to apply to all the rules, including attention to positionality. What are the glasses? What is the lens you use when you look at all those data? You have to ask questions about validity. How will I know that those data actually help me to answer my research question and that they are more or less reliable? There are ethics involved. There's also ethics in doing web-based research. And we have to always ask the relevance as well as the question, what can we do? So what? Who's interested? Who cares in this research? And how am I going to make sure that those people will actually be helped with how I approach my research question and answer it? Alright, that's it already. This was lecture 3. Thank you. Keep watching.